and talk about how the implementation of those new voting rights is going. I've added here, before we jump into that, a list of upcoming elections in Michigan. Even though it is an off year, we still have some local elections throughout the state. So these won't be in every jurisdiction, but you can go to michigan.gov/vote to look up if your jurisdiction has an upcoming election in May. And then as we get closer to the August election, you can also look that up. And then currently the presidential primary for Michigan has been moved up recently to February 27th, 2024, which is one of the earliest states in the country. So really the presidential primary is right around the corner. So, all right, let's dive into Prop 2 requirements. So I'm going to test everyone's knowledge real quick of what new voting rights Michigan voters now enjoy, thanks to the passage of Prop 2 last November. So does anyone want to name one or two that they know about?
9 days early voting.
Yeah, that's right. Early voting, 9 days minimum. Any others?
Once you register for absentee ballot, it is good until you no longer exist.
Yeah, you have the option of requesting an absentee ballot for every election now. Great. Automatic registration when you get a license unless you opt out. Okay, let's go.
I was gonna say the stamp, postage, postage stamps.
Yeah, prepaid postage. That's right. Good one. All right, so here's a good list here. We already mentioned a few of them. So it's permanent absent voter mail ballot list. Prepaid return postage for absent voter ballot applications, absent voter ballot drop boxes, we get more, and early in-person voting. So as we go through each of these items in a little bit more in depth, you'll find that the implementation of each of these things might be at a little bit of a different stage. So some, like the permanent AV list, which are a little bit maybe easier to implement, while others like early in-person voting are a bit more tricky with a lot more moving pieces and more costs. And we also need more clarification from the legislature before we can really move forward on some of these pieces. So we'll get more into that as we dive into each piece. So let's get started. So we're going to go through each of the items and talk about the current status, but I just wanted to throw this in there because the passage of Prop 2 gave Michiganders such great new voting rights, and it's going to increase access to voting and to the ballot and make it a lot easier for people to vote, which is amazing. But that also means a lot of work for folks in the BOE and for election administrators throughout the state. So this is a bit how people in BOE are feeling right now, but it's always a good feeling whenever folks get more voting rights. So we're really looking forward to the implementation of these things, even though there's a lot to do in the meantime to get it implemented. So let's start with the permanent absent voter ballot list. Hold on, someone's calling me right now. Don't they know I'm presenting? There we go. Okay. So does anyone know what that, there was a previous box that you could check on your absent voter ballot application that did something kind of similar to what this new right does. Does anyone know what it meant if you checked the box previously before Prop 2 passage on your absentee ballot application?
My understanding is that you would be sent an absentee ballot request every single time. That's what
Yeah,
I'm reading.
That's right. So we previously had a box on the application that if you checked it, it was called like the absentee ballot application request list. And it would always send you an application every election cycle to apply for an absentee ballot again. And a lot of people would be confused because they thought, well, when I check that box, why am I not just getting my ballot again? Well, that's just not the way Michigan law was set up. We weren't able to do that. We could only send you an application every cycle. But with the passage of Prop 2, we are now able to set up that permanent absent voter ballot list, which means that the ballot will be mailed to people who request it for every election cycle going forward, which is pretty cool. So a few items to note here. Let's talk about what happens when a voter moves within the state to a new address. They are required to update their voter registration address, which also updates the address reflected on your driver's license or state ID. And if the voter has also checked the box to request a permanent absent voter ballot be mailed to them for all future elections, the mailing address for their absentee ballot will also update, including across jurisdictions. So they'll always be sent to the address that it's supposed to be. So voters can also request to be taken off the list. And there are a few ways that this can happen. First, if they request it, maybe they change their mind and they don't want to vote absentee anymore. If their voter registration is canceled, so maybe if they move out of state and they register in another state, that's part of ERIC, and they communicate to us, hey, this person moved here, so we would cancel their voter registration. Or if we have reliable information that the voter has moved from their registration address and they haven't been voting for 6 years, and so they get kind of taken off the voter registration rules. So those are the reasons why someone would be taken off this list. And then finally, this update is a requirement for all jurisdictions and all elections. So does anybody know, was it a requirement previously for election clerks to keep a permanent absent voter application list? Anybody want to guess? No. Well, the answer is no. It was not a requirement. So some people in some jurisdictions might have checked the box to receive that application every election cycle and then not received anything because it was not a requirement for clerks to do it. But now it is a requirement. Every clerk in every jurisdiction throughout the state have to maintain this absent voter ballot permanent list. So some really
Sarah,
great
can I ask you-
updates.
can I
Oh,
ask you
sorry,
a
go
quick-
ahead.
No, just a quick question. Do you know if that applies to Uocava voters or not, or just in-state?
I'm sorry, to what?
Uocava out of voters abroad? Or
Oh,
is
I
that just
believe it
in-state?
does. Yes.
So we can be permanently,
I believe
email
it
their
does, but I
ballot?
can follow up on that.
I'll
So,
find, yeah, I'll ask you later. Sorry, thanks.
Sure, no problem. Good question.
But that also means for all local elections, like the May 2nd and the May 8th election also? Not- Okay.
All right, so here's where we're at here are the steps that we're taking and election administrators are taking for implementation of this particular piece. So with these changes, BOE and election administrators really have to figure out how to do something we've never done before. So it takes time for every piece of implementation of Prop 2, it's going to take time. And so you'll find throughout this presentation that some of these changes happen faster than others. And for the permanent ballot lists, here we have an overview of the steps we're taking. So we have to update the AV ballot applications with the option to join the list, which I'll show you on the next slide. We have done a little bit of. We have to update the qualified voter file to collect and track the list status. We have to overlap with other absent voter status considerations, including those military, overseas, accessible, multiple mailing addresses. Then we have to distinguish this request from the pre-existing permanent absent voter ballot application list that we were talking about. And we have to do clerk training and most importantly, voter education and outreach. So these are the steps that we're kind of working on right now. So where are we at right now? So we're working right now on updating the qualified voter file. Does anybody know what the qualified voter file is?
That it has the registration information for all Michigan voters.
Yep. That's exactly right. This is the centralized voter registration system and list maintained by the Bureau of Elections, and it contains a list of every registered voter in every jurisdiction in the state. So the QVF is in the process of being updated to track all of the things we need to track for the permanent absent voter ballot list, including recording who checks the box, updating any moves, tracking information for when ballots are sent to the voter and also received by the clerk, and a few other items. So our goal, excuse me, internally is to have the QVF auto update finalized by the August elections this year. So something else to keep in mind here is that with each of these updates from Prop 2, there are increased costs in administering elections that will need to be addressed. So what do you guys think might be an increased cost for permanent absent voter ballot mailing lists?
Postage.
Yep, that's right. Postage, printing, more people requesting ballots is always a good thing, but that also means more costs. So with this option available, it means, like I said, more people requesting things, which is great, but that means higher costs. And another factor is the anticipated increased hours for clerk and election assistants across the state to manage the higher volume of absentee ballots we're going to see, printing, mailing, and the receipt of those ballots. So just something to keep in mind. So here you can see this is our updated absent voter ballot application. And look, it has the box and it is updated. You will not, unfortunately, see the same updates on the online version of the absent voter ballot request form or the application. And that's because, like I said, we're still working on getting that QVF to tie into that so that it automatically updates. But right now it is available on the print form. So anybody wanting to go ahead and check their box can complete the print form and submit it, and it will work that way. We can manually enter the information into the QVF. So that's one check on our list. All right, next item on the list of Prop 2 updates is prepaid postage and ballot tracking. So all voters now have the right to state-funded prepaid postage on absent voter ballot applications and absent voter ballots themselves. Notably, this is consistently a chief recommendation from college student voting advocates and from the MDOS Collegiate Student Advisory Task Force. It's always been a recommendation to have prepaid postage and ballot tracking because students often experience difficulties procuring stamps for voting, or maybe don't even know where to go to get stamps. So with the passage of Prop 2, now that won't be an issue, which is really great. Another piece is that now all voters have the right to state-funded system that tracks submitted absent voter applications and ballots, including electronic notifications regarding deficiencies in the application or the ballot and the need to cure. And that'll be available at michigan.gov/vote. So these are some of the steps for prepaid postage and ballot tracking. First, prepaid postage and ballot tracking likely require design changes to applications and ballot envelopes. And that's just so we can accommodate the space on the envelope to print the prepaid postage and the information on the envelopes, which doesn't quite work with the current design. So another hurdle is that the jurisdiction mailing practices vary widely between jurisdictions. Some smaller jurisdiction clerks use manual mail delivery, while others use mail service providers and vendors to print and mail their applications. So the state's job is to figure out how we can standardize this process so that every clerk has access to free postage. So here is what we're planning. The BOE is working with the United States Postal Service to establish a permit process by which each jurisdiction will be able to print their applications and their ballot envelopes with a permit that will be billed to the state. So clerks will be able to print their applications and ballots with postage included, and then the state gets the bill. So it sounds easy, and it should be easy, except that establishment of this permit means establishing separate billing details for each of the municipal jurisdictions in the state. Does anyone have a guess for how many municipal jurisdictions there are in the state of Michigan?
Thousands.
I was
Yeah.
gonna go 100.
Yeah, so it's 1,520. So this process will take several months to finalize. So what about the upcoming May election? A lot of municipal jurisdictions typically send applications to voters on the permanent AV application list about 75 days out. And some prefer to send the applications in advance of that date. And unfortunately, our dealings with the US Postal Service and getting that permit for the prepaid postage, that will not be finalized by that time. However, the BOE is instructing jurisdictions that they can reach out to the United States Postal Service themselves to get that prepaid postage for their applications and for their absentee ballots, and that the state will reimburse them for those costs. So that is our hope for what will take place during the May elections. So as I stated, statewide implementation of prepaid postage and ballot tracking will not be ready for May. Local jurisdictions hopefully will be able to take care of that for folks that live in their jurisdictions. And the state is working with local jurisdictions to reimburse them. Both updates are currently underway, and we expect finalization in late 2023 in time for the 2024 elections. So once we hit those really big elections next year, all of this will be taken care of. All right, so let's talk about drop boxes. Some new updates from Prop 2. It mandates that every municipality must have at least one drop box for every 15,000 registered voters. Even if the municipality has under 15,000 voters, they still have to have one drop box at least. And the proposal would require that they be distributed equitably throughout the municipality, although it does not define what this means. So equitable distribution is really kind of left to the discretion of the clerk there. And drop boxes must also be available 24/7 and are required for all elections. By BOE estimates, these new voting rights for Michiganders will require about 2,000 additional drop boxes throughout the state, which is a lot, which will allow for much greater accessibility for Michigan voters. In terms of the implementation, the state is working really quickly to plan how to acquire these drop boxes for jurisdictions. And when making purchases this large, 2,000 drop boxes is a big purchase. There are really specific procurement rules the state has to follow. And unfortunately, it can take time. So we've drafted an RFP to solicit bids from vendors, and that's currently where we're at in the process. We are waiting for bids to come in from various vendors. And again, you may be noticing a theme here with all of these things, that the process just takes time. So once a vendor is selected, BOE will provide a catalog of drop boxes to clerks, and they can pick from those which one they want. And then once this ordering process becomes available, the Bureau will prioritize jurisdictions with an August election. So we do expect to have additional drop boxes available in those communities that will have August elections, and then ones with May elections, and then ones with November elections, with the final delivery to the rest of the jurisdictions prior to any elections in 2024. So each jurisdiction will have the opportunity to order a new drop box, even if they received one in 2020. All right, so this is the big one. Those 9 days of early voting that I think someone mentioned earlier. So this one, I think, is the one most people are excited about, and it'll cause the most amount of change in the planning and coordination of our election system. So Prop 2 mandates that voters now have the right to 9+ days of early voting in person. So what does this mean by early in-person voting? A lot of you may think of voting absentee when you hear that, because before now, anyone could go to their clerk's office before election day and fill out an absentee ballot and submit it. And that was sometimes referred to as early voting. But this early voting is just a little bit different. It will be in-person polling place style voting. So the Constitution now refers to these places as voting sites, and states that voters at early voting sites shall have the same rights and be subject to the same requirements as voters at polling places on election day. So notably, the Constitution only requires 9+ days of early voting for state or federal elections, and it leaves it to the discretion of local jurisdictions to run early voting for local or special elections. And at these voting sites, ballots will be run through a tabulator, just like you would at your polling place, but the final tabulator reports will not be run until election night, just like how your polling place works now. And lastly, and this is a big deal, municipalities within a county can share voting sites hosted by a municipality or by the county. So if I live in Lansing and there's an early voting site in East Lansing that's run by Ingham County, I could go to that early voting site in East Lansing and cast my ballot from my jurisdiction in Lansing. And all those updates sound really cool, and they are really cool, but they also mean a lot of logistical and financial hurdles that need to be overcome to implement early voting. First, the programming of voting equipment. So that is necessary because to ensure ballots can be tabulated prior to election day with the results report not run until election day itself is a thing we've never done before. So we need to make sure that the machines are capable of doing that. And additionally, when you allow multiple jurisdictions and municipalities to come to one voting location to vote, it means that voters will be receiving different ballots. So if I'm from Lansing and I go to the voting site in East Lansing, I'll be issued a different ballot than a voter behind me in line who's from East Lansing. So different issues will be on my ballot depending on where you live. So in order to accommodate this, election administrators need updated equipment that can differentiate between these different jurisdictions. Also, clerk and poll worker training needs to take place, including retention management and storage of voted ballots at combined precinct sites. So we need to figure out not only how to staff 9+ days of early voting, but how to store these ballots. And in line with the programming of voting equipment, the early voting electronic poll book or the voter check-in process needs to be updated. So does anyone know what the electronic poll book is? I'll give you a hint. It's very similar to the QVF. Anybody? E-poll book? Any poll workers here? Nobody?
Yes, it's an electronic statement of every single voter in that area, in that district, in that area.
Yeah, that's right, Norma. So it is basically a download of information from the QVF that has all the information about registered voters within a single jurisdiction. And that's what poll workers use to check you in whenever you go to your polling place and you check in. They'll look you up in there to make sure that you're at the right place. And they use the e-poll book to do that. So does anyone know what is special about the e-poll book on election day? Or maybe even the laptop that the poll worker uses to check you in on election day?
It's incredibly secure.
It is, but what makes it secure? I mean, there's many things that make it secure, but what's one thing that makes it secure?
Well, it matches exactly every ballot that has been cast.
It does.
We're checking every hour to see if in fact it's the same number.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm getting at is it's not connected to the internet, right? The e-poll book at one polling place is not connected to the e-poll book at a different polling place. And that's for security reasons. For that one day on election day, e-poll book is not connected. However, with 9 days of early voting, that's a lot longer for e-poll book to not be updated and connected to the internet. And in thinking this through, BOE realized that records of who voted and where they have voted recorded in e-poll book would have to be updated more regularly or even instantly to accommodate shared voting sites. So does anyone have a guess for why that might be?
I would venture to say so somebody doesn't go and vote in another site.
Exactly, exactly. It's for security reasons to prevent double voting. Because if e-poll book's not instantly updated saying that someone voted, what's to stop that person from going and voting at a different polling site? Not saying that anyone might be motivated to do that, but it is illegal after all, but it could happen. And we need to know that information and have it recorded in e-poll book for us to catch that and stop it from happening. Oop. Sorry, guys. So e-poll book updates definitely are something that needs to be updated. Next is logistics and resources to support and staff appropriate and accessible elections for 9+ days. And then public education and outreach. And that's going to be a really big one, especially because as it stands now, it means that local elections may or may not have early voting, and statewide and federal elections will have early voting. So it can be really confusing for voters, not knowing like, will I have early voting? Will I not have early voting? It's really not standardized right now. So it's going to take a lot of public education and outreach from the Department of State, Bureau of Elections, and from local election administrators across the state. So as you may have noticed, as we've gone through these items, there are a lot of items on the to-do list for BOE and local election administrators. And we certainly have our hands full. And indeed, some of these new requirements and updates require more clarity or explanation than what we currently have for us to get started on them. Meaning that additional legislation is needed to allow election administrators to perform their duties. So these are just a few examples listed here. First, we just talked about e-poll book. Right now, that e-poll book is not legally allowed to be connected. So we need clarification from the legislature on if e-poll book can be connected to a network or not before we can even start figuring out how we can securely do that. We also need additional guidance from the legislature on how clerks can retain and store ballots at those voting sites with multiple precincts. And the third item has to do with an update from Prop 2 involving military and overseas voters. So if serving in the military or living overseas, voters have the right to have an absent voter ballot counted if postmarked on or before Election Day and received by their clerk within 6 days after Election Day. And currently, there is no mechanism or timeline allotments for how postmarked ballots that arrive after Election Day will be processed by a clerk, tabulated, and shared with county canvassing boards. So there are a lot of adjustments that really need to be made, and we need the legislature's help with that. So these are just a few examples that are needed for implementation. Does anyone have any other examples that they've heard about? I know there's a lot of like working groups right now that are kind of assessing like what additional information do we need for clarification. So does anyone have any other examples that they've heard of?
Yeah, I have one. I'm involved in a working group, Sarah, as you know, that the Secretary of State's put together. And one thing that's come up is with the drop boxes, what exactly does it mean to have them equitably located?
Yeah.
For any given population, does that mean, if they require 2 for a municipality, are both of them just going to be at City Hall? Like, what does it mean for them to be spaced out where they're most accessible? And that's something that still needs to be figured out.
Yeah, that's a great example. Like I said, when we were on that slide, it does not define what equitable distribution means. So it's left at the discretion of the clerk. And, we're hopeful that that means it will be equitable, but like, what does equitable even mean? So we really need some more information on that. That's a good example.
I think another one, and it kind of in that bucket, is voter registration within the early voting period. And early voting sites, if you can't register at them, won't be accessible for most students. And some clerks can get around to doing, it's technically an early voting site and a satellite clerk's office site, so get around it that way. But if there was ways to change the legislation so they didn't have to do that workaround to have it technically be 2 different things at one spot, then it would really allow students to use that more. So
yeah, that's a great example. Any others that anyone's heard about? Well, I'm sure we'll all hear about a lot more in the coming weeks and months, because I know that this is a really important issue that the legislature is working on right now that we know needs to get resolved quickly so that BOE and election administrators can start moving on these pieces more in time for elections later this year and for elections next year. So I'm sure you'll be hearing much more about it in the news, or maybe even from me or Landon or someone else. All right, so next item here. The other thing that we really need from the legislature is money. So as I've gone through each of these items, I've kind of touched on these items. While it's really great that they're giving us new rights, they also will cost a lot of money. So we talked about printing more ballots for the automatic or for the permanent absent voter ballot list. Think about funding for stamps, and that's going to cost more money. And even when we look at 9 days of early voting, it costs a lot of money for clerks to set up and train and hire for one election day. And now we have 9 additional early voting days. So it's really, the costs are kind of piling up. So election administrators really need that support, not just from the legislature in the form of clarification, but in the form of funding. So clerks should really be involved in this process, and they are involved in this process in determining specific cost breakdowns, as it will vary by jurisdiction. So the cost to keep early voting sites open for 9 days in Detroit at many different locations, it's going to cost a lot more than it would in a much smaller jurisdiction outside of a city. So we already know we need the funding for, like I said, 9 days of early voting, including at least 3 election workers for 72 hours, equipment and rental space, for staffing, for absentee ballot processing, for ballot drop box security, for those additional ballot drop boxes that have to be added now, and for additional equipment and permanent staffing. So that's something that we're also asking the legislature for, which is always fun to ask for more money. So those are really all the updates that I have for you guys right now. Are there any questions?
I had a question regarding the funding. I know that the governor released a budget a proposed budget, where there was a segment there for voting and elections funding. How does that proposed budget interact with the process that the legislature is going through and the requests that you guys are making? My understanding is that that number that she proposed was not high enough for the needs.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious how that whole negotiation process is unfolding.
Yeah, so I don't personally take part in the negotiation process, but from what I understand, what the governor allotted, it was a great amount, but we do expect that we will need more. And so we expect that to come from future supplementals. So we're just currently in talks with clerks to kind of determine, okay, how much more money are we actually going to need? We're currently in talks with vendors for, the drop boxes and working on some of the software and machine updates that we're going to need to determine costs. And we'll be in communication with the legislature on those costs the entire way through. And we do hope that the additional funding will come from supplementals.
I did post in the chat that budget and what it looks like. My organization works hand in hand with the Secretary of State, and this is shareable for my director as well as a GoGo. We work with the GoGo. So
Great. All right, I see we're almost out of time, but if anyone has a question I can answer in 20 seconds, feel free to ask it.
If we want to continue to stay updated on how all this is unfolding, what would be the best way for folks to do that?
You should subscribe to election administrator updates through the Bureau of Elections, and I can email